Strait of Hormuz is fully open and ready for business.
On a Friday in April 2026, President Trump proudly announced from Phoenix that the Strait of Hormuz had fully reopened for business. Less than 24 hours later, Iran's Revolutionary Guard, the IRGC, closed it again. Multiple vessels were forced to turn around. The IRGC opened fire on at least one ship, and Iran began demanding conditions before any passage would be allowed. Trump's response was blunt. Iran cannot blackmail the United States with a strait closure. And if a deal wasn't reached by Wednesday, he said, we'll have to start dropping bombs again. This is where we are in 2026. But to understand how we got here, and more importantly where this is all heading, you have to zoom out. Because what looks like an Iran crisis is actually something much, much bigger. Russia is fighting in Ukraine, armed with Iranian Shahed drones and North Korean soldiers. Iran used revenue from those weapon sales to fund Hezbollah and other proxies surrounding Israel, which helped trigger the October 7 attacks. The United States then ramped up military aid to Israel. Then came the Iran war itself. Russia returned the favor by sending drone assistance back to Tehran. Arab allies backed the US effort. Ukraine started helping those same Arab nations with drone defenses. Pull back far enough, and you realize we are already living in a world at war. The fronts are just spread across multiple continents. But there is one event that would make this officially, undeniably, World War III. And it has nothing to do with Iran. It is China crossing the Taiwan Strait. Before we get to Taiwan, we need to properly understand Iran. Because the Strait of Hormuz crisis did not start with Trump. It did not start with the nuclear deal. It started over 70 years ago, and America's fingerprints are all over it. In the early 1950s, Iran looked nothing like it does today. Women walked the streets of Tehran in Western clothing. The country held democratic elections. It was modern and progressive. But Iran had something that made it both the luckiest and unluckiest nation on earth: oil. Britain had been exploiting that oil since 1914, when the British government acquired a controlling 51% stake in the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Between 1914 and 1950, that company paid the British government approximately £90 million in corporate taxes. Iran received just £35 million in royalties over the same period, roughly 1/3 of what Britain collected just in taxes, let alone total revenues. In 1951, a 69-year-old lawyer named Mohammad Mossadegh was elected prime minister. He was secular, Western-educated, and fiercely nationalist. His position was simple: Iran's oil belongs to Iran. He nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and proposed a 50-50 profit split, the same deal American companies had already offered Saudi Arabia. Britain refused, and for good reason, from their perspective. If Iran could nationalize its oil, what would stop Egypt from nationalizing the Suez Canal? What would stop every colonized nation from taking back its resources? Britain's empire was already crumbling. They could not afford this precedent. So Britain came to Washington. But this time they were smart about it. They didn't pitch it as an oil dispute. They called it a communist threat. If Mossadegh wasn't removed, they argued, Iran would fall into the Soviet Union's orbit. And remember, America had just watched China fall to communism and was deep in the Korean War. Washington bought it. In 1953, CIA officers arrived in Tehran with suitcases of cash. They bribed newspaper editors. They hired street gangs to create chaos. They even paid people to impersonate communists and threaten religious leaders, to make it appear Mossadegh was anti-Islam. On August 19, 1953, the operation succeeded. Tanks rolled in, around 300 people died in the fighting. Mossadegh was overthrown, arrested, imprisoned for 3 years, and spent the rest of his life under house arrest until his death in 1967. A pro-Western monarch, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was installed in his place. American oil companies entered Iran. The Shah bought American weapons and opened the country to Western influence. For Washington, it was a clean win. But for Iranians, the Shah was a puppet. His secret police, Savak, trained by the CIA, imprisoned, tortured, and executed thousands of political opponents. For 25 years, resentment built. In 1979, it exploded. Millions took to the streets. The Shah fled. Ayatollah Khomeini, a religious leader who had been exiled by the Shah, returned to power. Iran went from a pro-Western monarchy to an anti-Western theocracy almost overnight. And then the Shah traveled to the United States for cancer treatment. To most Americans, that was a medical visit. To Iranians, it looked exactly like 1953 all over again. America sheltering their deposed leader before reinstalling him. Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and held 52 Americans hostage for 444 days. From America's perspective, it was terrorism. From Iran's perspective, that embassy was a CIA command center, which given 1953 was not an unreasonable assumption. The hostages were finally released in January 1981, literally minutes after Jimmy Carter's presidency ended. A final humiliation that destroyed his political legacy. From that point forward, the relationship became one of permanent hostility. Diplomatic ties were severed, and they've never been restored. If you're finding this valuable, hit subscribe to the Purple Analyst. This is exactly the kind of deep dive context that most news channels skip. The hostility didn't stop with the embassy crisis. When Saddam Hussein launched an 8-year war against Iran starting in 1980, the United States saw an opportunity. Saddam was fighting America's enemy, so Washington quietly backed him. The US gave Iraq satellite intelligence on Iranian troop positions, sold them helicopters used in combat, and provided dual-use technology for weapons systems. When Iraq used chemical weapons against Iranian forces, the United States lobbied at the United Nations against condemning Iraq. To Iranians, the message was crystal clear. America's problem with Iran had nothing to do with human rights or international law. It was pure power politics. After that war ended, Iran turned seriously toward nuclear development. Iran's stated position, and their legal right under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, was that this was for peaceful energy purposes. But American and Israeli intelligence assessed otherwise. Here's why Washington couldn't accept a nuclear Iran. The entire Middle East order runs on deterrence. Gulf states rely on American military protection. Israel maintains an undeclared nuclear arsenal. Iran, up to that point, was contained. But a nuclear-armed Iran would neutralize American military presence in the region, provide a protective shield for proxy groups like Hezbollah and the Houthis, directly threaten Israel, and potentially trigger a nuclear arms race with Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt. Worse, it could unravel the petrodollar arrangement, under which Saudi Arabia and OPEC price oil in US dollars in exchange for American military protection. The entire architecture of American power in the Middle East could begin to crack. So the US spent years escalating sanctions. Then, in 2015, the Obama administration brokered the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. Iran agreed to dismantle significant portions of its nuclear infrastructure and accept extensive international inspections. In exchange, sanctions were eased. Iranian oil exports increased. The economy stabilized. International inspectors confirmed Iran was complying. Then Trump won the 2016 election. In 2018, he withdrew the United States from the deal and reimposed sanctions, eventually adding over 1,500 new designations targeting Iran's economy. Iran's currency lost roughly 2/3 of its value. Oil exports collapsed. Iran's response? Restart and accelerate the nuclear program. Enrich uranium to higher levels. Move toward what experts call breakout capacity, the point at which producing a weapon becomes a matter of weeks, not years. Which brings us to 2026. Iran's nuclear facilities have been bombed. Its economy is devastated. Thousands of Iranians are being killed in the streets demanding change. The Trump administration has issued directives aimed at driving Iran's oil exports to zero. And the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's petroleum passes daily, is now a live flashpoint. Now here is the part that should genuinely concern you, because everything we just discussed about Iran is actually the setup for a much larger confrontation. China has been watching all of this very carefully. The island of Taiwan sits at the center of the world's most dangerous potential conflict. Taiwan operates as a de facto independent democracy. Beijing considers it a rogue province that must eventually be reunified with the mainland, by force if necessary. And for years, both sides have maintained an uneasy balance. Taiwan doesn't formally declare independence, and Beijing doesn't invade. But that balance is under more pressure than at any point in decades. Here's why. China's one-child policy, which ran from the late 1970s until 2015, was devastatingly effective at reducing population growth, and it has now created a severe demographic crisis. China's working-age population is shrinking. Its military pool is contracting. The window during which China could project sufficient military power to successfully invade Taiwan is not permanent, and according to many analysts, it is closing. Xi Jinping reportedly set 2027 as a target deadline for the People's Liberation Army to be ready for an invasion. Not as a confirmed invasion date, but as a military readiness benchmark. The most recent intelligence assessments suggest even that timeline may need to be pushed back. The core problem is amphibious capacity. An invasion of Taiwan requires massive numbers of landing ships to put troops ashore. As of late 2025, the PLA had capacity to transport roughly 20,000 troops in a single landing operation. Credible estimates for the number of troops required to successfully take Taiwan range from 300,000 to 1 million. That is an enormous gap. China is working to close it. The PRC now controls approximately 53% of global shipbuilding capacity, and it is using that advantage to build out its naval fleet aggressively. So the strategic calculus in Beijing looks something like this. Wait for the United States to exhaust itself in Iran, finish building enough ships, and invade Taiwan before the demographic window closes completely. There's also a more alarming near-term scenario. American weapons stockpiles were already stretched before the Iran campaign began. They are lower now. Congress will fund replenishment, but that takes time. Some analysts believe Beijing might look at a temporarily weakened American military posture and decide a partially prepared invasion against a partially prepared defense is still worth attempting. If that's Beijing's calculation, the calendar matters. Weather in the Taiwan Strait is severe. Fog, monsoons, rough seas for most of the year. The only months suitable for a major amphibious operation are April, May, October, and November. The spring window this year is effectively gone. That leaves October and November as the months to watch. There is also a longer-term pathway. Taiwan's semiconductor dominance, which gives the United States a powerful economic reason to defend it, may not last forever. Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing company, TSMC, is already building fabrication plants in Arizona. If that shift continues over the next decade, and America's economic dependence on Taiwan diminishes, Beijing might simply wait, and then move quickly, betting that a future American president won't consider Taiwan worth a war. That would be a very dangerous miscalculation. But miscalculations are exactly how world wars start. So, let's bring this full circle. Iran and the United States are locked in a conflict rooted in a CIA coup from 1953, a wound that never healed. The Islamic Revolution of 1979, the hostage crisis, the Iran-Iraq War, the nuclear standoff, the JCPOA, and now the bombing of Iranian facilities and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. It is all one continuous story. Meanwhile, Russia is fighting in Ukraine with Iranian drones. Iran's proxies triggered a war in Gaza. The United States went to war in Iran. And China is watching America's military bandwidth shrink while quietly building the ships it would need to take Taiwan. These are not separate crises. They are connected chapters of the same story. The optimistic read, war is expensive. Taiwan and China both know this. Iran and America both know this. Rational actors avoid catastrophic conflicts. The realistic read, history is full of rational actors who miscalculated. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide. The Taiwan Strait is 110 miles wide. Both of them right now are among the most consequential stretches of water on the planet. What happens in those straits over the next few years will define the next several decades. That's it for today. If this kind of analysis is what you're looking for, no noise, no spin, just the context that actually matters, subscribe to the Purple Analyst. Share this with someone who's trying to make sense of what's happening in the world.